Good morning. It's an incredible honor to preach in this inspired congregation and inspired pulpit. The scripture is from the 4th chapter of Luke, beginning using selected passages and my own interpretation of the passage. Let me see, I'm going to have to find it in here. The 4th chapter, beginning with verse 16, selected passages. When he came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read from the prophet Isaiah, another passage of which you've just heard. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. And then he said, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing, and because a prophet is without honor in his own hometown, the crowd in the sanctuary rose up in fury and ran him out of town. Well, I grew up in a church like the synagogue Jesus grew up in, a fancy church in Buckhead, Atlanta's privileged quarter. Good news to the poor didn't sound like good news to us. Release to the captives, to the police chief on the third row, sounded like letting criminals out of jail. Recovery of sight to the blind, the ophthalmologist who sat behind us would have thought to be quackery. And let the oppressed go free. Well, that was exactly what the awful Martin Luther King across town was saying to the poor people there. Nobody dared say that in my church. If they had, it would have sent us all into an uproar, me included. My people and I were born in sin, living in sin. Most famous Christian in those days was Billy Graham, who I thought was like Jesus, which means, if you think about it, I thought Jesus was like Billy Graham. Billy Graham's preaching convinced me that I was born in sin, living in sin. In time, I came to think of sin as especially our Jim Crow culture. But that was not what Billy Graham said it meant. And I wanted to be like Jesus, like Billy Graham. 10,000 more or less of us lived in Buckhead from in those days, in the 1950s, some very privileged. None were black, not one. Thousands of black people, though, came to Buckhead every day on the bus, in the back of the bus. Came from the Negro section of town. They came to do menial work in menial jobs for menial pay. Buckhead in the 50s was the very definition of Jim Crow. What I liked best in those days was going to Daddy's office on Saturdays with Daddy. I'd sit in the accounting pool and type figures on somebody's adding machine. And I would pull the crank and roll out the figures down on a spool of paper to the floor. And then I'd go to Daddy's window and look out at the tall buildings downtown. What I didn't look at was across the street, the Negra section, where people came from to buses to Buckhead in the back of the bus. I could see their church from Daddy's window. Daddy said it was called Ebenezer Baptist. The parsonage of Ebenezer was just 2 blocks down from the office. The pastor was named for the leader of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. His son and namesake lived there too. We didn't know that, didn't care. But the pastor's son grew up and became a pastor himself, Dexter Avenue Baptist in Alabama's capital. I was 15 when I first heard of him, Martin Luther King Jr. I heard of him because a woman in his church by the name of Rosa Parks sat down at the front, not the back of the bus, where she was by law required to sit on their Jim Crow bus. And the black pastors formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, and he, Martin Luther King Jr., being the best educated and the pastor of Rosa Parks and, well, the new kid in town who didn't know any better, was elected president. And they began the Montgomery bus boycott and the transformation of American history. From then on, I hated Martin Luther King Jr. All I knew of him was carefully edited distortions in Southern Jim Crow media, which never mentioned his PhD from Boston University, his biblical preaching, the hymn singing of his followers, his biblical preaching, the charisma of his oratory, never his prophetic reasoning or its foundation in Scripture, let alone his compassion for the likes of me. None of that. Just carefully selected caricatures of a raging, crazy man. Who he really was and would become, the seminal theologian of 20th century Christianity, reincarnation of the biblical prophets, herald of justice, architect with Gandhi of nonviolent social change, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, hero now to 2 generations across the planet, icon of tomorrow's national holiday, the only American not a president in 250 years to be so honored. Him we could not ever imagine. As Jesus said, no prophet has honor in his hometown. In time, I met him, read his books about him, had the incalculable privilege of late-night, bourbon-lubricated conversations with his best friend, Ralph Abernathy, and others of the heroes of the movement. But that was later. I was born into the wake of slavery, residual Civil War bitterness, still redolent Reconstruction humiliation, cultural limitations of Southern journalists, sneering racist conversations. The other passage from Isaiah read in a different translation than this. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Jesus knew this poem by heart, engraved indeed on his soul, and was inspired to take it up as his singular ministry, and so with Dr. King. Here's what happened to me. I was 20 years old in a North Carolina college, still Jim Crow, living in sin. 4 African-American students in Greensboro, 30 miles away, were on TV news, having illegally sat at a Woolworth's lunch counter that reserved the right to refuse service to anyone who looked like them. They said on TV that they had been swept up into the hurricane started by Dr. King in Montgomery. And then one said, I can shop at every counter in downtown Greensboro but the lunch counter. And then he said, that isn't fair. Well, that was something that even I, Jim Crow as I was, could understand. For the first time I had to think about it. We talked about it in philosophy class, got categories to think about it with. Then a friend invited me to go downtown, meet some students from a black college across town, and do what they did in Greensboro. Without much thought, I went. When we got to Woolworths, the police came. They said we had 1 minute to leave or be arrested. Arrested? I'd not thought of arrested. They hadn't been arrested yet in Greensboro. And 1 minute was not near long enough for me to think about it, so I was arrested for civil disobedience, something I'd never heard of. Arrested for breaking the segregation law and for crossing my family's, my church's, my college's, my culture's reddest line. 10 black students, 10 white students herded into separate but equal paddy wagons and herded off to separate but equal cells in the Winston-Salem City Jail. I had known what I was doing, what I had gotten into, hadn't even decided to do it, but was suddenly alienated from literally everyone I loved, my entire cultural and religious landscape. In my terror and confusion, I beat a path to the only one I'd ever heard speak positively about Dr. King. That was Mac Bryan, my religion professor. For the next 3 months, he became my mentor, taught me who Jesus really was. Not a popular evangelist like Billy Graham. No, Jesus was a despised and rejected, compassionate, civil disobedient, like Dr. King. Like my first black partners at the lunch counter, who were, by the way, the first black peers I'd ever met, even I was swept up into the movement of Martin Luther King Jr., the kid down from Daddy's office, who used to celebrate his birthday on January 15th with his parents and a few friends. Surely he has borne our griefs, carried our sorrows, was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Dr. King taught his followers the meaning of the gospel. He said for his followers to love even Jim Crows like me, to confront me with the inhumanity of my attitudes, my structures, my laws, and then openly break those laws, call down the fury of those structures, not on me, but on themselves. Don't reciprocate my hatred for them, he said to his followers, but to take my hatred on themselves. Be wounded, not for their own, but for my transgressions. Accept the chastisement of my disturbed peace in a spirit of love. Then, he said, my Jim Crow iniquity will, in the miracle of Jesus, be healed. And so it has.